Welcome back to our study of experiencing God, the 12-week study written by Dr. Henry Blackaby. And this week, our title is The Crisis of Belief. Our memory verse this week comes from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, and it says, "Without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." One of the truths that we want to look at this week, which was on page 133 of the workbook, is, and I quote Dr. Blackaby, "Anytime God leads you to do something that has God-sized dimensions, you will face a crisis of belief. And at that point, what you do next reveals what you believe about God." We'll be talking about that in today's section. Also, today's lesson is built around the fifth of the seven realities. Let's review that briefly. Reality number 5 says, God's invitation for you to work with him always leads you to a crisis of belief that requires faith and action. So in day 1, the title of our lesson was A Turning Point. And here we got a definition of what a crisis of belief really means. You see, it doesn't have to be a calamity. A crisis of belief is really a turning point. So one of the illustrations this week that we have is from the story of Gideon from the book of Judges, chapter 6 and 7. And you see, Gideon faced a turning point when God called him to assemble an army to hold off the combined forces of the Midianites and the Amalekites. Even with his full force of 32,000 men, it would have taken a lot of human, military, strategy, and high levels of motivation for Gideon to have been successful. But he trusted God, and then God told him to reduce the size of his troops from 32,000 gradually through several different steps down to 300. So Gideon was at a crossroads where he had to choose whether to believe God and believe that God would hand him the victory with only 300 men against these two nations, or did he want to resort to his own plan B and do something different? So this is what we call a crisis of belief, a turning point. On day 2, we began looking at 4 truths about a crisis of belief. And the first truth is encounters with God require faith. As we just explained in the story of Gideon, at that crossroads, it was going to require faith for him to follow God with his 300 men and try to stand up against these invading armies. There was also a story on page 140 of the workbook about the hiring of a missions minister, Len Cotter, to Dr. Blackaby's church. You see, the church up in Canada felt led to reach more people for Christ. And the problem was they didn't have a budget, but they needed some extra help. So they ended up talking with this guy, Len Cotter, and his wife about coming to Canada and being their missions director. They didn't have the money to pay his salary. They did not even have the money to move him there. Len Cotter and his wife had saved $7,000, and they decided that they would be willing to come, accept the call, and participate in missions, helping to spread the word in Canada, and they would pay for it for as long as they could out of the money that they had saved. So this was a real crisis of belief for that church. And then here, this couple agrees to also accept a crisis of belief because they felt this was something God was calling them. Well, as the story goes, money shows up in some unexpected places, and this ministry ends up getting funded. The church had faced a crisis of belief. They could have said, we need to wait till we have the funds before we call a missions director, but they felt so strongly that God was leading them in this direction that they went ahead even without the funds. The missions minister felt so strongly God was calling him and his wife to be a part of this that they proceeded, not having any security that the funds would be there. And a lesson about the crisis of belief was learned by all. One of the takeaways from this story is found on the bottom of page 138, where Dr. Blackaby writes, "If you can clearly see how something can be accomplished, more than likely faith is not required." So why does God call us to God-sized things that require faith in order for us to accept the encounter? Well, I think there's at least two reasons. One, this is how God builds relationship with us. Think back to reality number two, which was God is always pursuing us for a relationship, a love relationship that he wants that is real and personal. This is how God builds that relationship, and this is how we come to learn to trust him. But I also think there's a watching world out there that God also understands. And if God can accomplish things that couldn't have been accomplished by humans on their own, that communicates to the lost world and draws them closer to God. So I think that's a second reason God uses this to draw people to him. So in day three, we took a look at the second reality or the second truth about a crisis of belief. And that is that encounters with God are God-sized. What is God-sized work? Well, God-sized work is any work that could only be done with God's help. Some of the examples from the Bible that we're all familiar with are the story of Abram and Sarah, who were well beyond childbearing years, and yet God was able to make a great nation out of them. And then we have the story of Moses, talking Pharaoh out of his captive workforce. And then what about the disciples feeding the 5,000 with Jesus' help that day? These are all examples of uh, God-sized work that God would call us to. One of the takeaways from this particular day that Blackaby said is that when you sense something that is of God and it's a calling, if you can handle it on your own, then it's probably not a calling from God. So the second truth is God encounters with God are God-sized. So in day four, we get to the third truth about a crisis of belief, and that is what you do reveals what you believe. So think about Gideon. What did he do? Well, he believed in God and he took his army of 300 and they were successful. But more importantly, it communicated to the Israelites who God was, and think about the experience for Gideon. Going forward, his faith was deepened because of that experience. A couple other examples that Blackaby gives us is the story of David and Goliath. David going up against Goliath was a crisis of belief, but he believed that this was something that God would protect him and help him be successful. He believed it was God's will, and so he was willing to do that. And again, we know David went on to do much greater things. And then we think about the story of Sarah, Abram's Sarah, and how she had a crisis of belief, knowing that she was well beyond her childbearing years. Human reasoning kicked in, and she decided, as a contrasting example, to go with a plan B, which was give her maid to her husband as a wife. And through that came Ishmael. And we know that Ishmael was a thorn in the side of Israel for many, many years. So there's a downside when we choose the wrong fork in the road. God eventually is going to get the job done that he wants to get done with or without us, but it will take a crisis of belief for us to join him. And finally, on day five, we got to the fourth truth about a crisis of belief, and that is that true faith requires action. Blackaby directs us to the 11th chapter of Hebrews, which is that great faith chapter. And in there, we took a look at the names of 8 different people that are talked about and commended for their faith. And one of the points Blackaby wanted us to understand is in looking at what was said about them in that chapter of Hebrews, that it always started with the action they took, and that was what ended up getting them a commendation for their faith. So it took great action to demonstrate their faith. What we find interesting and challenging, however, is that it didn't always work out. The outcomes weren't always good by our standards, by human standards. In fact, we were asked to make a list of some of the things that turned out to be the good outcomes and contrast it with some of the bad outcomes. Listen to this list. On the good side of the ledger, we have things like routed enemies, conquest or conquered kingdoms, weakness turns to strength, women receive back their dead, gain what was promised. But on the bad outcome side, we had things like stoned to death, tortured, chained in prison, put to death, even sawed in half. So what are we to learn from all that? What are we to make of all that? If these were people who were commended for their faith, and yet not all of them had good outcomes by human standards, what are we to learn from that? Well, Blackaby makes a couple of really good points at the bottom of page 151. He says, outward appearances of success do not always indicate faith, and outward appearances of failure do not always indicate a lack of faith. So what he's telling us is that just because the outward appearance, the worldly or the humanly evaluation of an outcome appears to be a failure, doesn't mean that the person lacked faith. And by the same token, if it turned out good, doesn't mean it was a result of faith. But here's what we do learn. God has planned something far better for the people of faith than the world has to offer. We see a quote from Hebrews chapter 12. Here we're talking about Jesus. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So we're to look to Jesus as our example here. Good outcomes are never determined on this planet. They're always determined in heaven. There was also one more quote from Blackaby that's worth repeating. He said, speaking of those who had worldly outcomes that would be considered failures, he said, they decided a well done from the master was more important than life itself. So what do we take away from this unit? Well, I think number one, we take away the fact that if God calls us, it's going to be God-sized. Number two, when he calls us to something God-sized, it will take faith on our part to move ahead. It'll be something that we can't see ourselves accomplishing without him. Number three, we can count on it that our relationship with God will deepen, and this is what he's after with us. Number four, it provides a great witness to the watching world when we're able to accomplish things that could only have been accomplished with God's help. And finally, a faithful servant does what the master asks him to do, regardless of the cost. Well, I hope you had some revelations this week, as I did, about the crisis of belief. I also hope you'll join us again next week. Here's what Dr. Blackaby says about Unit 8 as a way of introducing us. He says the next unit will look more carefully at the cost of following God's will. Part of the action required to demonstrate your faith will be the adjustment you must make to God. Following God's will always requires adjustments that are costly to you and even to those around you. Well, until next time, God bless you and have a good week.